Which approach is more effective in curbing drug abuse, punishment or incentive? Is the state powerless against the growing wave of drug abuse? This panel will examine these pressing questions and discuss how governments can strengthen regulatory frameworks and uphold zero-tolerance policies to confront the global drug crisis and contain its spread. Please welcome our panellists. Carlton Brick, lecturer in sociology at the University of the West of Scotland; Stuart Derbyshire, associate professor of psychology at the National University of Singapore; René Nehring, editor-in-chief of the Preußische Allgemeine Zeitung; Géza Sebestyén, head of the Center for Economic Policy at MCC; Mónica Serrano, professor of international relations at the Colegio de Mexico; and Ralph Schoellhammer, head of the Center for Applied History and IL Theory at MCC.
All right, thank you very much. I already have to play a little game. Can I ask the two gentlemen of... No, wait, it's fine. I'm so sorry. So you can see that the names of everybody in case you want to Google them and find out more about the professional and personal lives. So that the name is above their heads. This is a summit on the issue of drugs and drug abuse, but I do hope that everybody is well caffeinated after lunch, because this is one of the drugs that we do actually permit here. The other drug we permit is wine, but that will follow in the evening, so I think everything is well organized. I run a very tight ship on this panel, meaning that I'll give everyone of you 5 minutes for your introductory remark. We have a very, very diverse panel, different views from politics to psychology to science, so I think this is really a great way to look at the issue at hand from many different angles. And Dr. Brick, I would like to start with you, if that is okay.
That's fine. Yes.
All right.
Thank you. Just a little bit of background about me. I'm a sociologist. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not involved in drug addiction services. So I'm come from this issue from a particularly kind of political, sociological background, and I work in Scotland, and Scotland is the European leader in drug deaths in Europe. It currently kills, or drugs kill, approximately 280 addicts a year per 1 million of population. That's 3 times the level of England and Wales combined. And I began, a couple of years ago, I began to try and interrogate why Scotland, which is culturally and sociologically very similar, if not the same, as its close neighbours, England and Wales, why it was such an outlier. Why was it killing? Why was it a European leader, if not a world leader, in the tragedy of drugs deaths? And what I began to kind of realise, and this is perhaps where I'm going to say something a little bit different from the kind of what the panel and what the topic of the panel is about, because I actually think in Scotland particularly, as an example, government policy has become a driver of drug deaths. What we have in Scotland is a political elite that have become wedded to harm reduction as ideology. Not harm reduction as a form of treatment, but harm reduction as an ideology. And what has happened is that addiction is no longer perceived to be a social problem as such, but the problem is represented as society as a problem for the addict. So we have NGOs in Scotland, such as the Scottish Drugs Forum, who are the key harm reduction NGO in Scotland, who influence and shape Scottish drug policy, who now consider the idea that an addict should recover as a form of discrimination, on a par with racism and sexism. So we have an increasingly a political elite that have become wedded to a kind of dogmatic ideology that has begun to problematize very important narratives around addiction, abstinence, and recovery. The social consequences for this, from a kind of sociological perspective, I think are kind of very dangerous, in the sense that not just for the addicts themselves, who remain addicts and as addicts die addicts, but also kind of broader sociological kind of the types of societies that we want to see ourselves live in. This isn't unique to Scotland. I don't think it's particularly unique to Great Britain, but it's certainly a trend that has begun to creep into kind of Western democratic liberal societies, is that there's been a kind of creep, a concept creep, where addiction, the idea of addiction, becomes used to describe increasingly more numbers of kind of social forms of behavior. So we're addicted to social media, we're addicted to television, we're addicted to sex, we're addicted to pornography. So addiction has become a dominant narrative through which we are increasingly invited to validate and identify with. And what this narrative does, it kind of decouples us from our kind of subject, our nature as kind of agents, of individuals who are able to impact the world and shape the world. So we become kind of neutralized. So these kind of narratives of vulnerability, these kind of pathologized forms of identity, become ways in which new relationships become developed between states and their citizenship. And I think that's kind of what is going on. So whilst I take on board kind of the excellent discussions that were had this morning, there are broader sociological trends that are bound up in the drugs issue, and in particular the way in which addiction, which drug addiction is a kind of prime example, becomes a way through which states, political elites, expert elites begin to relate to broader society and broader citizens. So increasingly we become not citizens of society, but patients of society. We become not agents of our own choice, we become kind of victims of circumstance. And that's a very, very dangerous narrative to go along with. It has increasingly kind of corrosive and dangerous consequences. Because basically, it dislocates us from ourselves, our communities, but also dislocates us from the elites who are making policies over ourselves. It deactivates us as a demos. So one of the key things that I'm developing through my research is that the relationship between kind of drug narratives, narratives of addiction, harm reduction as ideology, and its democratic consequences. So we increasingly have kind of political elites who are unaccountable, Western liberal political elites who become increasingly unaccountable to the demos, become wedded to unaccountable ideas, and those ideas have tragic consequences because they become so wedded to them as dogmas that they are killing their own citizens.
And we'll get into those ideas in the discussion,
okay.
Because as I said, I have to run a tight ship. I have to run a tight ship time-wise, but I think I got everybody's attention. Before I forget, you can via the Slido app or Slido.com, you can submit questions, and we're always looking for the most provocative and most insightful questions during the Q&A at this panel. So please feel free if you feel provoked or if you feel that something is unresolved or anything pops to your mind. Just go on Slido.com and you can submit your questions and we will ask them in the Q&A section. Professor Derbyshire, the floor is yours. 5 minutes.
Yes, I got it. Thank you very much. So yeah, thanks for the invitation to join this important discussion. I come to this discussion as someone who studied pain for about 3 decades, and mostly with the aim of eradicating pain, which always seemed like a good idea, but through that I became embroiled in the opioid crisis. And the opioid crisis should have taught my profession some difficult truths. One is that when a society tries to eliminate all discomfort, we tend to breed fragility. And I think fragile people are easy to addict. Another thing is that we can't prescribe difficult problems away. So we can't, basically prescribe our way out of despair. The drug epidemic, I don't think, is about supply. I've heard a lot about that today. I don't think it is that. I think it is more a symptom of despair, a symptom of social disintegration, economic insecurity, and the loss of a shared meaning. And we can't arrest our way out of despair. We can't legalize our way towards a better meaning. So the drug crisis, I think, begins when life starts to feel empty, when it starts to feel humiliating, when people feel unseen, when work doesn't offer the necessary dignity, when community becomes dissolved. Drugs then can become the chemical translation of a hopelessness. And we've seen those conditions emerge in the so-called Rust Belt of America, and also to some extent in the former industrial areas of Europe. In too many cases, I think the discussion of this problem also tends to mutate into a discussion about individual resilience, and that tends to also deepen a person's demoralization. It's kind of blaming the victim, if you like. It's one of the pathways through which people are drawn towards a life of addiction. So the state, I think, does have some tools. I think they're quite limited, but they do have tools, regulation, enforcement, education, healthcare. But those tools will only work, I would argue, in a society that already has a strong moral and social order. So punishment works best when there's something for the person to return to. Most Americans in Vietnam became addicted to narcotics while they were out there, but when they returned to the US, 80% or so managed to get off the narcotics that they were addicted to. They did that not because of punishment, but because they returned to family, they returned to work, home, purpose, and a less chaotic society than the one they'd left behind. Likewise, I think decriminalisation can only work in societies that still possess some sort of deep social capital. So Portugal did have some success, and still does, to be fair, but that success relied on treatment, it relied on jobs, it relied on family integration, and probably a social capital that they already had in the bank. When those supports started to fade, the death rate began to rise again. The Netherlands managed liberal policies for years without any seemingly serious consequences, again, probably dependent on an underlying trust, stable families, and civic decency that we've seen erode over the last 10 to 20 years. Decriminalisation without a community, I think, risks surrendering society to a pharmaceutically managed decline. The opioid crisis in the United States shows a different kind of mistake. There we attempted to medicate despair rather than confront pain and despair. A pain-free life is nirvana. It is utterly impossible. No life worth turning up to is going to be pain-free, is going to be suffering-free. We turned distress into a medical problem, we ignored its necessity, and we offered opioids instead of meaning. It felt like compassion, and we felt like social warriors beating down the barriers to treatment, but really I think it was weakness, not strength. A capitulation to adversity, not a real victory. And the result has been millions of wasted lives, a profound crisis of confidence in medicine and government alike. So what can the state do? I think first, enforcement and incentives should be recognised not as opposites but as partners. A functioning state should uphold order and draw clear moral boundaries. But if people no longer believe in the value of law and order, that's going to be a very difficult thing to do. Second, I do think we've got to build the economic and cultural structures that give citizens a stake in society, so stable work, affordable homes, decent education, reliable institutions, a shared national story. I don't think these are luxuries, they're not psychological manipulations, they're foundations of prevention. People will rarely destroy the life they're leading if they're living in a world that they actually believe in. And then third, I think we need to teach some endurance. Every strong civilization has known that hardship and suffering are not evils to be eliminated. They are experiences to be understood and overcome. When a society can no longer explain the meaning of pain, addiction will tend to fill that void. Not all pain is unnecessary, and not all suffering is pointless. The most powerful anti-drug policy, I think, is not fear, it's not leniency, it's something akin to faith. faith that life has meaning, that hardship can be borne, and that every citizen is part of a story worth staying awake for. Thank you.
Mr. Nehring?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, my name is René Nehring. I'm editor-in-chief of a German newspaper, so I am not talking to you here as an expert of drugs or in drug business. I'm not an officer of the police, not a drug consultant. I'm only speaking as a person who is week by week, day by day, watching into the society and making his own thoughts of it. And perhaps I can say the only way where I'm a small kind of expert is that I'm a father of 4 children, from 18 to 26, 26 or 18 is the youngest and 26 the oldest daughter. And this is really shocking. I live near Berlin. In fact, it's like Berlin is a suburb. It is really shocking to see that in almost every party you can get drugs. Like in my youth, you can get a chocolate or a Coke or something else. So it's really, really shocking. It's absolutely yeah, there's no hiding about it. They show it and they consume it, and not my children, of course, but if you look into the friends, at the friends, it's very shocking. So, and I'd like to talk with you a little bit about the consequences of the legalization of cannabis in Germany. You may have heard that until the end of March 2024, this consumption was officially forbidden, and our then traffic light coalition, red, social democratic, yellow, liberals and green party, they decided to legalize cannabis, and not from the beginning of the law, but from the moment where they decided to legalize cannabis consumption, you could directly see activities by the narcotic mafia gangs. They came from the Netherlands to North Rhine-Westphalia, which is the biggest federal country in Germany, and they tortured other gangs, and they tried to make their claims, and they directly knew, okay, there's a huge market for us, and so we can really see that there was no, even before the law was active, we could see the negative consequences of it. So, thank you.
Thank you. Géza?
Thank you very much, Ralph, and I'm happy to be here in this panel. It's really an honor. We have heard some very important macro perspectives of the problem. I'm an economist, I decided to have a micro level perspective. So let's imagine that our future self is sending us a postcard which says that, dear present me, thanks for all the good decisions you made in your life. And we can also imagine the opposite, which is in a lot of cases the usual case, that our future self is sending us a postcard that asks us why we did all the things we have done. And the problem, if we look at this from a micro perspective, the problem is that humans widely over-discount future harm. So if we look at future harm, we think that we can avoid it somehow. Everybody else is affected, but not us. It's a problem of the others, or we will deal with the problem when we'll get there. But right now, I want to be happy. I want to enjoy the party, drink a wine, smoke a cigarette, and have some drugs. It's not me, but about a fictitious person. And behavioral science calls this hyperbolic discounting, which is about the fact that if we have two choices, we can get, let's say, €100 today, or €200 tomorrow. In most of the cases, we take the €100 today, because we want to have the good things right now, and later we will see what will happen. But this is not only unique for humans. In the animal kingdom, the situation is totally the same. It was researched many, many times that if you take pigeons and they can have a small meal right now, or a little bit bigger, a little bit later, they will pick the small meal today. Or also squirrels, when they are under stress, they can eat their entire stash, and then they obviously will have some problems in the winter. And the problem with drugs is that, yeah, it has, everyone knows, it has negative consequences on the health of the individual, but the biggest problem, in my opinion, is that it has very negative consequences on the society itself, on others, on family members, on the employer's situation, on the healthcare as well. So if you look at how we decide, how we humans decide, the situation is the same for smoking as well, that yeah, we want to have that cigarette, and obviously we can't quit any time, so we will quit in a week. We have a stressful week. We have to get over this week somehow, but we will quit for sure. It's very easy, and we will do it. But if we meet that person 2 weeks later, or maybe this person is ourselves, we still smoke. Because once again, giving up something today, it's very, very hard. This hyperbolic discounting has a lot of other effects as well, like the magnitude effect, that if there is a big future loss, then we try to avoid it, try to not to think about it very, very strongly. Also, we deal with future gains differently than with future losses. So psychology plays a big role here as well. And in my opinion, a good drug policy is trying to prevent us to do harm to ourselves, to do harm to our future self, because us humans, and once again animals as well. So this is very very common. We do make mistakes, and the good system is trying to force us to make good decisions and avoid the social costs of our bad decisions for us and for the others as well. So I hope that after this roundtable we will have much more information, ideas how we can create a system which can help individuals to send grateful postcards to themselves from the future. Thank you.
So now we know that for economists, everybody is either a squirrel or a pigeon. That's a very, very reassuring. Professor Serrano, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I tend to think of the drug problem in terms of what Peter Reuter referred to as the drug problem, which is a complex problem that entails many, many dimensions that interact in very different and complex ways. So we know from the studies about drugs that they entail high risks, that the risk of addiction for a group trying heroin can be as high as 23%, for a group trying cocaine over a certain period of time could be as high as 15%, and for the new varieties of marijuana, which are, as we've been told before, more potent, the risk can be also significant at around 10%. But some would also argue that the drugs entail benefits, and drugs, some that are prescribed, certainly do so, and there is new research on psychedelics in different kinds of treatments that Stuart may be able to tell us more about. So there is a debate, but we have a century of efforts at prohibiting drugs. We have an international drug control regime that has a long story that would take me over an hour to explain, with some illegal drugs, basically natural drugs, being the object of prohibition from the early days. Opiates, basically morphine and heroin, then cocaine and marijuana, and others considered but heavily resisted by pharmaceutical companies and gradually reined in through efforts from certain countries, including the northern countries. But what we know from the record of over 100 years of these international efforts, as we know also from the efforts in the US at prohibiting alcohol, is that expecting to impose strict limits on substances that enjoy demand in society perhaps was not realistic and perhaps was not even particularly wise. Rather than trying to regulate these substances, those who endeavored to build the international drug control regime thought that it was possible to eradicate them, to completely prohibiting them. Even though they have the lessons of alcohol prohibition with all the damages that they brought into institutions in the US, demoralizing the police, capturing some police corps, increasing violent homicides in a number of cities, overloading the judiciary. Those who were committed to prohibition in drugs blamed the failure of alcohol prohibition in the US to the lack of an international approach, and thus went on to try to prohibit it internationally. What we have seen clearly in Latin America is a history in which one substance that was the target of prohibition and became the object of efforts to eradicate it was simply substituted by a new substance, particularly when society was not backing prohibition or when an addicted population was already entrenched. And not only was it failing in the US, in a context in which, according to David Herzog, in the US there was also a divide with white rural areas becoming customers and having access to the medical system, becoming also patients who received medications which were not particularly or properly regulated. So that was one side of the coin, and the other side of the coin is the way in which prohibition in the US proved impossible to enforce, and not only that, it also proved impossible to enforce in regions that were producing particularly the natural drugs. Efforts to stop marijuana being trafficked between Mexico and the US simply shifted the production of marijuana to Colombia, where it was not contaminated by the fertilizers, or not the fertilizers, the herbicides that were used in the campaigns in Mexico. And the efforts to clamp down on marijuana through the Nixon years were then also replaced by an increased trafficking in cocaine. And the consequences for the countries that produce were significant for a number of reasons, not least that when demand remained in place, but the market was disrupted through interdiction, the prices went up. And when prices went up, that attracted new and more ruthless suppliers for a short time. But over time, as we are seeing in Europe, prices went down, and that is basically because producing these drugs, it comes very cheaply, and the traffickers account in their cost the cost of replacing the confiscated drugs. So this is an unending story that has been going on over a year. The last episode is, of course, the fentanyl crisis in the US, which is a completely homemade crisis that was pushed by pharmaceutical companies as they had pushed barbitures before. And having created an addicted population, a significant addicted population, the US governments, starting from Obama, rather than acknowledging that reality, they just closed the access to what had been legally available drugs that had already created a very significant number of addicts in the US. And that led to 3 successive waves of the opiates crisis. The first one was the replacement of those drugs which were no longer available in chemists by heroin being supplied by Mexico, and later on by fentanyl, which had followed exactly the same route as had been the case with previous drugs. The efforts to clamp down on one led to an ever more potent and more easily concealed drug. Cocaine, then methamphetamines, now fentanyl. The result of that is, in the US we had the overdose deaths overpassing 1,000 at some point, not a few years ago. But the other face of that was the violence that it unleashed among criminal organizations, certainly in my country, in Mexico, but in the region as a whole. The latest report by Crisis Group shows, I think, correctly that violence is intrinsic to the drug trade, to the illegal drug trade, and the cost of that has been a significant loss of death that in my country over the last 20 years has involved about 500,000 people. 70% or so of those deaths are related to these illicit markets, but also a very important part of that explains the power of these organizations is the vicinity with a country, the US, where arms are completely unregulated. And that has meant that these actors that are in fact strengthened by the repressive policies have had access to war-like weapons, Barrett 50 caliber weapons that have made the proposition of being a public servant, certainly an army officer or a police officer, almost impossible. The result of all this is that the US has, not on its own, there are lots of failures that I don't have time to refer to right now in terms of the countries themselves, but building institutions that can cope with this has turned to be impossible in a context in which the mix of drug policy and arms, unregulated arms market, have empowered cartels that you may have been able to watch in the Narco series and other films.
Thank you. As a moderator, I'm in a very difficult situation because I proposed questions to you before this panel, but now after hearing your remarks, I have a plethora of other questions that I would like to ask. And as the saying goes, as a moderator, I'm here to moderate and not to make friends. So I'm just going to deviate slightly from the prepared questions, and I hope you will indulge me. Stuart and Carlton, both of you, I think, alluded to something that dovetails nicely with the title of this panel, which is about the state's arsenal against drugs. But based on your remarks, would you say that drugs are the problem, or drugs are the symptom of a larger problem? Carlton, what would you say to this question?
I think the drug issue is a symptom of a much broader question about the nature of society, and specifically in the democratic character of society. The drug issue, pulling on, I think Stuart explained very, very well the solution, the individual. Drugs becomes a retreat when you're not invested in culturally, when the world has no meaning for you. And that seems to be the current condition, particularly kind of Western liberal democracies. And what we have are political elites that are no longer held to account. They become unaccountable. And not to beat about the bush, I think kind of what we're seeing in the drugs death crisis, particularly in Scotland, but more broadly in Europe, is what happens when elites become unaccountable. So the issue here for me is not drugs per se, it's the culture that creates both the kind of the problem of drugs, but also these kind of very dangerous ideologically driven responses to the drug problem.
Yeah, I mean, I'd endorse a lot of that. I mean, naively, I think, when the opioid crisis began, we thought as clinicians and as researchers what we were doing was helping people deal with a physical problem. I think it became clear quite quickly, perhaps not quickly enough, that really we were dealing with a more spiritual problem, if you like, that there are areas of America and outside of America where lives are already lost and where people are already trying to escape the life. So that the mantra for us was that we give chronic pain patients opioids so they can live the life they want to lead, not to escape the life. But in actual fact, we were giving opioids to people who did want to escape their lives. And when you withdraw their source of opioids, they go looking for it in illicit ways rather than legal ways. And I don't think we can solve that problem through just pulling the levers of enforcement. Enforcement has a role. I'm not against it. You know, the law should stand for something and mean something in people's lives. But if that's all you've got, then that will just add further to people's despair and push them further down the hole that they're in.
Before I continue the panel, can I ask two quick follow-up questions, which I think would be a good fit? And one is, when we talk about drugs, like on this panel, we speak mostly about very significant drugs, like heroin and fentanyl and opioids. We don't speak about the occasional cigarette and the occasional glass of wine, I hope at least, because otherwise then I have to commit myself. But what about because you also mentioned previously in your remarks about the clinicalization of society. So one of the things that we observe these days is that whether it's young kids or easily diagnosed with attention deficit disorders, but also when people have symptoms of depression, when they lose a loved one or something and they get antidepressants or something. Do you think that falls also into the category of the drug problem, or is that a separate issue?
I think that is the drug problem. It's the medicalization of particularly adolescence and childhood. It's a tragic irony that and I suppose this is the sociological point that I'm trying to make, that the drugs addiction crisis is a reflection of a broader medicalization of society and of life, where we tolerate the medication of young children as a substitute for adult discipline. You know, that's the problem here. So kind of adult authority has given way to medicine. And to me, that's the real drug crisis, is the way in which we now, without question, use medical phrases, medical terminology, and physical medical products to substitute for what are human problems around authority, around belonging, around meaning, and basically disciplining and socializing young people. We too readily turn to the pill to solve what are actually social breakdown in adult authority, really.
Yeah, again, I would very much endorse that. I mean, I can't walk across my campus now without seeing at least half a dozen posters telling people, you know, that if you're stressed, it's okay. If all you manage to do today is get out of bed, that's okay. If you need to talk to somebody, go and talk to somebody. Go get counselling. Are you anxious? Are you depressed? And we are, I think, destroying young people. We have a well-being day twice a year at my university, and that day is the day that you can lie in bed or go on holiday or whatever you want. I'm not against a day off, but the message that sends to young people is that being at university, studying, being in classes is bad for you. And also for faculty, doing your job, lecturing people, holding them to account is bad for you and bad for them, so we shouldn't do this. What an insane message to give young people. The default assumption used to be that yes, university is hard, but you will survive it and you will get through it and you'll come out of it better. Now the default assumption seems to be that you will not survive it, you will be stressed out by it, and you will need help to get through it. We are annihilating young people's mental health, and it's no wonder they're turning to chemical solutions for their problems.
So, René, you are a keen observer of German politics for decades now, and you spoke already in introductory remarks about Germany's cannabis problem. Now, if you dive a little deeper into the political side of this, because I think what we have now unpacked a bit is that there is an ideological side to this, right? An acceptance side. So why was it that in Germany, particularly the left of center parties, were so keen on the legalization of drugs? Was it driven by just goodwill or kind of the desire to feel good, or was there an ideological background as well?
I guess, or it's obviously that it's because of a cultural background of them. This is a part of their cultural DNA since the 1970s, and yeah. So this is the short version, and yeah, it's the short answer of your question. So it's part of the DNA and of the left and green parties. Yeah, so.
But would you, if you would be an advisor to the current government, would you advise them to revoke the policy changes that were made under the previous government?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we have see a lot of negative consequences, and I think the thing that has such negative consequences, like the liberalization of drugs, should not be allowed. So. Of course, you just spoke on the experiences with the prohibition in the United States. So, and of course, alcohol, and you spoke about smoking is a completely different problem. But in Germany, we till spring 2024 did not have such huge problems with cannabis. So. We can really say there is a clear consequence of a clear act of governments, and so I'm sure if you can remove the step and or take it back, so there would also be a clear consequence of such a step, and so yeah, and the other thing is that we should take this on as a cultural struggle or even a cultural war. So we should not longer allow to say that using drugs is cool or is funny. Yeah. As I already told you, I saw young guys in my garden coming to a party, 50 people, and some of them were taking drugs, and after 1 hour, after 2 hours, they were sitting in the corner and they were absolutely quiet, quiet because they smoked cannabis. And I said, what a very, very sad use. Yeah, they are not wasting their health, they literally waste their lives. So yeah, this is the best time in your life, yeah, where you can be very active, do a lot of funny things, and we should not allow so-called progressive people to say that this is a cool thing. So this is not cool. This is not progressive. This is just a crime.
Okay, so you're an economist, so you don't care about all these ideological, philosophical, and moral questions. For you, it's all about costs, benefit, and incentives. So tell us about the costs, tell us about the benefits, and to put a little bit of a provocative end to my question, I mean, what's so bad about feeling good?
Nothing. I want to answer this part first, and I also would like to come back to what Stuart and Carlton said, because it's very important in my opinion that I totally agree with you that drugs are a symptom of a much larger problem, spiritual problem, and especially young people feel that life is not offering them good choices or a bright future, meaning, belonging, whatever. On the other hand, I don't know who said this, but if you feel yourself bad, then just pick any history book from the shelves. Just open it anywhere, just read 5 minutes, 2 minutes, and then you will see how lucky you are. Okay, so if I look at my life, for example, and I compare my life with the life of my parents envy my life because of several reasons. You know, Hungary was communist when they were my age, so obviously they had a much harder life. If I look at the life of my kids, I envy their life because they have a much better father. No, my father was great, but they have very easy life in a lot of regards. If I would look at my grandparents, they would envy my parents actually, and I'm completely sure if I would look at grand whatever parents, they would envy their kids. They would think that their kids are having a better life. And I think that the reason for this paradox that according to any objective measure, kids today have a much better life, much better chances than kids anywhere in history. I actually blame the Mexican TV series. Sorry, the Brazilian ones. But I really think that TV series and online media and social media is guilty because when I was younger, we were watching TV series, and in every Brazil soap opera, they were living in a huge house. They visited the capital of the city or the capital of the country every week. They had nice cars, and nobody was working. Nobody was. You never saw anybody working. So I also watched the Dallas, of course. People were drinking all the time, but nobody was working. And I think that the problem is that if I look at my kids, for example, they are looking at social media, at Facebook and Instagram and other social media platforms, and it seems that everybody else is having a great life. So they just enjoy the park. They are here today, in another part of the world tomorrow, and they always in sunshine, and everybody is happy. So I think that the core problem is this, and obviously this has to be solved. So I totally agree that this is a big problem, and if you want to deal with the drug problem, then we have to deal with this problem as well. I don't know how we can solve it. I'm an economist, and I can talk about this for a long time, but I cannot solve it, unfortunately. But on the other hand, I really think that if we think about the drugs and the economic consequences of drug use, then the negative economic consequences are really huge. So if you look at any study, they estimate the negative consequences somewhere between 1 to 4% of the GDP, which is a very significant figure. And they usually don't look at generational negative effects. But there are a lot of studies if somebody is an addict, then the kid of this person has much higher mortality rates, has a much worse life, lower academic results. So obviously there is a negative generation effect as well on the next generation, maybe even further. So there are a lot of studies about transgenerational negative effects. So obviously I think that the negative effects actually, if you would really look at the future on the infinite horizon, are really huge, and because of that we have to deal with that somehow. And obviously every study which is analyzing the effect of regulation or policy actions on the situation is looking at one aspect of the problem. But if I'm an economist, I'm in finance, so if you would calculate all the total costs and the present value of all the future costs of this problem, then yeah, there should be we should find a solution for this problem as well. For the other problem too, obviously, but for this problem as well.
All right, Mónica, you're a professor in Mexico, so I think it is fair to say that in Latin America, but particularly in Mexico as well, drugs and the cartels has always been also in the economy, but I guess also in social life. So based on what Mexican governments are trying currently and what they're trying to accomplish in the past, how would you describe their policy approaches to deal with the drug issue?
Yeah. Well, we haven't always had cartels. The cartels started in Colombia in the 1980s, and I can tell you the story of Mexico very briefly. Over a century, Mexico started exporting opiates after opiates were prohibited in the US, and some Chinese people came down to Mexico, and that created the opportunity, once it was prohibited in the US, to supply those who were still demanding in the US. Marijuana the same, the big market came up in the 60s, 70s with those returning from Vietnam and the hippie revolution. And then there was the Nixon War, which basically clamped down. And the result of that clampdown was the spread of a number of families that had been engaged in this business in the north of the country, throughout the country. And that was the beginning of stronger organizations that were then ready to catch the cocaine market when the cartels in Colombia were clamped down in the early 1980s and the shift of cocaine was pushed onto Mexico's territory. But this is the story of enforcement leading to ever more powerful actors and organizations, which are now being trained in Ukraine to use drones, that travel through Colombia, Mexico, Ecuador, and buy the arms they want in the US, and mine fields. Drugs may be a reflection of a larger social economic problem or an expression of a cultural shift, but the fact is that these drugs are either supplied by illegal actors or legal actors. And in both cases what you have is an option of having regulated markets or unregulated markets. In the case of legal drugs, legally supplied drugs, I think what is a discussion is the different mixes and the different options, from harm reduction to treatment to prevention to some sort of restrictions. And the fact is that in illegal markets, you are basically talking of unregulated markets. The state, by prohibiting, is renouncing its power to regulate. And what happens is that when the forces of enforcement, international enforcement, are activated, you create the conditions for what we who study these dynamics call the balloon effect, by which the market moved. It moved from Turkey to Mexico in a matter of 1.5 years, when Mexico, having supplied only 10% of the US heroin market in the early 70s, in less than a year and a half was supplying 80%. These are powerful markets. So when countries decide among different options, including decriminalization or legalization, they are considering these pressures. And I wonder whether Germany was facing more dangerous drugs, and that was part of the consideration. It may have just been a political standing, but you have the case of Uruguay, a very enlightened country, one of the most stable democracies in the region, that took the decision to decriminalize marijuana because they knew the market of cocaine was moving through their port to Europe. And they enlisted the most enlightened experts, including Alex Stevenson, who then decided, on the basis of what we were discussing before, okay, we need to release a space for this government to have capacity to respond, and we cannot control the flow of cocaine. Let's create some space by decriminalizing marijuana. They just didn't give up any control. They chose the most regulated version, which basically allows people to have one plant in their house or buy in regulated chemists. Adults, only adults, the same as in Canada. I think these considerations are part of the equation that governments are taking into account because of the consequences of enforcement for even states with very strong institutions. The UK, a country where I did my doctorate, and there was never any sight of firearms. Now firearms are on the increase, and they are related to drug markets that are booming. So policemen in the UK are saying, you go undercover to try to go against these guys who are selling drugs, all you achieve is to strengthen the strongest. So in domestic markets as well as in international markets, there is, I think, the trade-off of enforcement. I agree with Stuart that one cannot give up enforcement altogether, but enforcement in countries like Mexico, Colombia, or Latin America that do not have strong institutions to start with is an impossible proposition, because illicit markets that are unregulated create the conditions for what we discussed, I think, yesterday. They create the conditions, they put not as much money as was mentioned yesterday. I think Peter Reuter has and others have done a lot of research to estimate the value of the US market, and we know that the bulk of the money is made at the retail level. But these are people that steal a mass significant amount of money, and with that money they can buy governments and institutions.
Can I ask you a very quick follow-up question? Because that's probably a very stupid question, so I immediately ask for your forgiveness as well. But when we look at the way in which the drug issue is reported, very often Latin America is reported as the origin country of exports to the United States. What about drug use within Latin America? So are drugs mostly exported, or is it also used in significant numbers domestically?
No, it's increasing, and it's becoming a huge problem. Brazil is the second consumer of cocaine. And it's becoming a big problem because the way the organizations, the thing is that then these countries are having to face at the same time domestic and international markets. And just imagine your police having to deal with a domestic problem and at the same time with macro trafficking. It becomes almost impossible. And the way the drug trafficking organizations, because that's the other thing, that enforcement creates the conditions for very violent competition among organizations, and the most powerful are the ones that are likely to prevail. And once they do what they are doing, and they did that in Colombia, but Colombia perhaps was more fortunate than Mexico in that the market was captured by two institutions that became like one entity, the paramilitary and the insurgency. In Mexico it's groups, so the market and the money changes from one group to another, and it's more difficult to pin down or to enter into negotiations like the Colombian government did. So that is what the countries are left with to try to maintain sovereignty, domestic sovereignty, and at the same time face the pressures of the US, which include 20 attacks killing extrajudicially about 80 people.
So Carlton, could this mean that maybe it's not so much a matter of, let's say, of political philosophy, but of socio-economic development? So as countries get wealthier, as they get richer, as the middle class is growing, we then encounter a growing part of the population that both has the financial means, but also maybe the desire to indulge in the use of drugs.
I think that's definitely been a historical trend that you can understand it through. But from the perspective, if you look at Scotland, which is kind of where I've kind of done not the vast majority of all of my research, is kind of concentrated in looking at Scotland as a problem. There's a very different and interesting demographic. So those that are dying of drug overdoses are not young people, they're people my age, men, and predominantly from socio-economic disadvantaged backgrounds, which is kind of the demographic that shapes the UK's drug death crisis predominantly. What's interesting about, or what's significant about, it's interesting and significant about the Scottish case, is that fentanyl hasn't arrived yet, so it'll be interesting to see over the next few years how that's recorded in having an impact. Over 80% of deaths are caused by opioids. 50% of those are methadone registers in 50% of those deaths. There's a lot of poly drug use as well. Methadone is the drug that the Scottish government gives to addicts to remove them off heroin. So we've got a very dangerous kind of loop that I do take your point about kind of, isn't this just the economic, historical, social development. But we are seeing something very, very different, I think, that is beginning to manifest itself. And I think Scotland is a good example of this, where political elites are beginning to organise around issues such as drugs. I don't think this is conscious on their part, but it's very much part of a way of renegotiating a relationship with civil society. And so I come back to the question that the real answer to these problems is a democratic one, is one about holding these elites to account. Now, as a member of society, I enjoy a drink, I smoke occasionally, and in my youth I dabbled and, you know, which you're supposed to do. However, I think, are we allowed to say that? Are we? No, perhaps not.
This is not advice,
right? Okay,
the young in the audience.
Just look where look where you end up if you kind of do that kind of stuff. However, I think we are kind of seeing something that is different. That isn't just the kind of social development we are seeing kind of political elites, particularly in Western Europe. I take the points that kind of these, and I'll end on this point, we're talking about kind of global drug epidemic, but I think that we have to remember that the problems don't always express themselves in the same way in different countries, in different cultures, so we have to be culturally specific about the nature of the problem and the potential solutions to the problem. In the kind of Western European Anglo sphere, I think what we are seeing increasingly is that political elites are beginning to organise themselves around issues around addiction, issues around victimology, issues around vulnerability, as a way of reconnecting with and recasting their relationship with wider society. And to me, that's the problem here.
Mónica mentioned a very interesting point before she spoke about enlightened government, and I think that's a very, very interesting point. Now, Stuart, you live and work in Singapore, if I'm not mistaken, and I think many people would say that the government of Singapore is a very enlightened government. Now, what is their approach towards drugs, both use and trade?
I'm not sure I've ever heard anybody suggest that the Singapore government is enlightened exactly, but let me. So,
and I have to copyright this one.
Singapore is a very interesting place for sure. So fewer than 3% of people in Singapore claim to have ever used drugs in their life. And if you look at the HIV transmission data, about 2% of all the HIV was by used dirty needles. These numbers are incredibly small. Most countries would kill for those kinds of numbers. So how did Singapore pull this off? And it's a very unusual extreme case. So Singapore came to existence against its own will. That's never happened, I don't think, anywhere else. They got thrown out of Malaysia. The SIA is for Singapore, but they decided after a few months they didn't want to be united with Singapore, and so Singapore was forced into independence. 2 million people, a little bit less. No water, no farms, no resources, not much of a manufacturing base, just a port. A real existential crisis. And Lee Kuan Yew, who was the then Prime Minister of Singapore, made the decision that the one thing he couldn't cope with was any kind of corruption of the government or of the people. And so drug policy became extremely draconian. You could be executed for possession. You were executed for bringing marijuana into Singapore. The foreign press said, you won't really do this. So, there's a YouTube video of him saying this, that, I hung the first one. And they said, you're just bluffing. So I hung the second one. They you're not going to do a third one. So I hung the third one. Now they believe me. And so that is an extreme message of, purpose when it comes to drug use and drug trafficking. And nobody thought it was worth taking drugs into Singapore for a population of 2 million people. So drugs did not pretty much exist in Singapore. But I don't think it was just fear. There's also that nation-building thing. They were in a precarious position. They did have to pull together. They did have major structural problems to resolve: housing, plumbing, education. The whole works. The funny fact: the International Toilet Society is headquartered in Singapore. because in the 1960s, hardly anybody had an indoor toilet. They were still pooping in the street. And they decided that this is something we must resolve, and they did resolve it in the early 1980s, and they became, you know, champions of toileting, and the headquarters of the Toilet Society is in Singapore. So they created a tremendous internal infrastructure, which I think is their greatest drug policy. So just one clear example of this is that 95% of Singaporeans own their own home. They own a home that the government built for them, didn't give to them, they don't rent it, it's sold to them, it's an asset, they keep it for 100 years or so. Many people have their wealth tied up inside this housing. They have no homelessness. In many countries, homelessness is at least a source of the drug problem, and they've eliminated that with a very enlightened, I'll give you that, housing policy, which I would love to say you could replicate that in another country, but I think it'd be really, really difficult to do, but maybe worth a try. Hungary, I think, 10 million people, so maybe a place like Hungary, that kind of thing would be possible. So to summarise, an intensely draconian approach to drug policy, which I think most countries would find very difficult to enforce. You'd have a proper war on your hands if you did that. And also a very pragmatic approach to social policy to solve all the problems that they face. Final point, it's not like Singapore is some sort of haven. They are not having any babies. Their fertility rate is well under 1. They're going to go extinct if they don't solve this problem. Within 4 or 5 years, they'll be in reverse population. And that clearly shows there's some underlying issues that Singapore has not resolved.
So if at the next pub quiz the question comes up, where's the headquarters of the International Toilet Society? It's in Singapore. That's the kind of knowledge how you start a conversation. René, what do you think? Do you think you could replicate Singaporean policies in Germany, or do you think the German people would not be takers of this?
Try. It's a very interesting question. First, we have not 2 million inhabitants, we have 84 million, so a little bit different lot of problems. I think another problem of what we have not spoken now is the question of an open society. So Germany is a very open society, and a lot of the problems that we get with drugs are, especially the poor people you just mentioned, reminds me that they came from foreign countries. When, for instance, from Romania, Poland, when they became members of the European Union, they could come to Germany, and even if they live there in the streets, they have a little bit more better life than in their home country. So I guess it's not. It's interesting what you said, but I guess we cannot take this to Germany because the countries are too different, and yeah. So of course the drug problems are higher in the big cities. If you're in small towns and small villages, the society is more stronger, more classically organized, and can hold even poor persons and weak persons, and so yeah, I guess it's not possible to compare this.
I guess if even the Prussian member of the panel is not for draconian methods, then it's not gonna happen anywhere. So, Géza, from your perspective, how should we create an incentive structure? So if we say, punishment or as the aforementioned draconian measures would not work in larger countries, so what kind of incentive structure would you propose?
First, I have a good news for us Hungarians and for you, Stuart, as well, because 90+% of Hungarians own their own homes. So we are quite good in that, and we are very strict, not as strict as Singapore, but we have a very strict drug policy as well. So we quickly implemented your advices. Thank you for them. And Mónica, you have mentioned that there are some countries in South America which are not having strong institutions, and because of that it's hard to deal with the drug problem. And I think this also gives us an insight into the long-term strategies. My first degree is a mathematician, and one of my favorite examples is the water levy problem. So if you have water levies, and let's assume that they double every day, and let's suppose that on day number 100, the whole lake is covered by them. On one day before, the half of the lake was covered, but on the 90th day, it's hard for you to find any water levies because the number is so small. And I think that if you talk about what you have very vividly told us, that if we have strong cartels, if we have strong players who are interested in the trafficking drug trade, it's very hard to deal with them. So it's in my opinion, it's much better to not allow them to grow to this size. So deal with the problem with draconian measures when the problem is small, and then we won't have any problems. And I think it's totally in line with what René has said previously about the situation in Germany as well. In my introductory speech, I was talking about hyperbolic discounting. I think that governments are also using hyperbolic discounting. That if already we said that drug use is free, it's very hard to reverse that because there are some voters which like the present situation. So it's hard to say that okay, yesterday it was free, but right now we prohibit it. So I think it's much easier to stick to one regulation, to stick to one system, not let drugs, don't legalize drugs, and it also helps in this other problem that the players are not growing big enough to create serious problems. And if you look at any economic theory, so how, if you legalize drugs, how would that affect the consumption? Any economic theory says that if you legalize something, or it's easier for the consumer to buy it, then prices will be cheaper. Non-price costs are also lower because you are not stigmatized, you are not afraid that you go to jail or you get prosecuted. It's easier to get the product, maybe it's even advertised, there is marketing behind the product as well. So obviously if you legalize it, then consumption should increase. And also the consumption per person who uses it should increase as well. So the more people will use it, and every user will use it more. And if you look at any research in the US, in Canada, anywhere, we see this same pattern. Okay, so when they legalized it, then more people used it, and people used it more frequently. So users used it more frequently as well. And if you think that drug use has any negative socioeconomic or personal consequences, then this pattern is not a good pattern, in my opinion. So legalizing drugs is not the right way to go. And another very important problem is that about its hyperbolic discounting, that we don't understand the long-run negative consequences of our present actions. It's true for everybody, it's true for me as well, it's true for everybody. But for some people it's even more true. And these studies were really underlining this effect as well, that in one of the studies, I guess it was a US study, they were looking at college students, so students who had a college degree and others who had no college degree. And what was the effect of legalization of their consumption? And it seemed that in both groups consumption has increased. In the group of the students who had a degree, the increase was very, very small, so almost insignificant, but it still increased. But in the other group, it was huge. It was very significant. So if we want to protect those who are not so educated, who are not able to understand less able to understand the negative consequences of their actions today, it is also suggesting that having a more strict system is better.
I want to slowly move into the questions, and Mónica, there are two questions that are directly addressed to you, so you're in the perfect position to answer them. It's about cannabis legalization in the United States. What effect did that have on the drug cartels, or the drug trade in general?
It took away a market from them. There is still some market because There are over 50 states in the US, and in not all these states marijuana is legalized. I think it's 35 for both medical and recreational, but it's 25, I think, for legalized recreational. So it has shrunk the market significantly, but the US market remains a magnet. It was estimated in 2016, without considering fentanyl, at $150 billion by Rand Corporation, and that includes heroin, cocaine, marijuana, and methamphetamines. So the supply from Latin America continues to be significant in terms of cocaine, even though the cocaine consumption in the US has stabilized. It's probably increased a bit over the past few years, but it remained constant and significant because there was an estimated, I think, 4 tons demanded by hard addicts by the late 1990s, early 2000s, maybe. So that creates a potential really magnet, insignificant magnet for organizations, not only Mexicans that were supplying methamphetamines and then cocaine, but mostly transiting through Mexico. But now cocaine is moving around the region and clearly destined to Europe, with consequences for Europe, including, for the first time ever, there is a video in El País where you can see a member of the civil guard being killed by traffickers. Probably not Latin American, probably from Morocco or bringing hashish. But the fact of the matter is that you are seeing very daring type of behaviors defying state authority. Fentanyl, the margin of profit in fentanyl for 1 kilo is estimated at around, that costs 80,000, I think, or it's estimated the margin of profit can reach even $2 million. But as I said, that doesn't mean that these people become the mosques of the drug industry, because the bulk of the money is distributed more democratically at the retail level. But they still take control of significant money that allows them to buy weapons, to submit or buy authorities, and to feel defiant enough to, I would never have thought, a policeman. I mean, this is the police created by Franco that has a lot of respect, a lot of authority, and yet they are chasing, and you can see the guard being killed.
Has anybody on the panel heard about the Icelandic prevention model? And I'll have to apologize to the questioner, because one question is about the Icelandic prevention model, and the question says, providing alternative social opportunities, youth centers, sports cards for youth, and apparently drug use hugely dropped in Iceland. So even based on the content of the question, do you think that instead of draconian measures or legalization, finding alternatives, whether in forms of community or community centers, could that be a way to address the problem?
Yeah, I mean, I don't hate that approach. I'm dubious that the state can pull this off, because the state doesn't have, generally speaking, a real sort of relationship with people. You know, like, I think Kevin this morning mentioned that strong families is the biggest predictor of not taking drugs. That's not a huge surprise to me. Having a loving family who knows you, understands you, can really relate to what it is you're going through is going to be a tremendous bulwark against all kinds of things that might tempt you. But I don't mind the state making some sort of effort to try and create a better environment, one that's more fulfilling than an alternative of drug use.
Do you think, and this question would also go to you, Carlton, do you think it's easier in a homogeneous society? Because, I mean, Iceland is for all intents and purposes, a fairly culturally and ethnically homogeneous society. So if the government then creates incentives for community centers, for youth centers, for people to come together, that probably is easier to pull off than in a very heterogeneous society.
I think that may be a dynamic in the sense that I think or societies where there is a buy-in, you're invested culturally, you're invested socially. So you know, you can have very diverse societies, ethnically, etc., which are cohered around common collective values. I think it's interesting in the sense, or significant in, I think Stuart's right. So in Scotland, for example, we have a very interventionist state. A state that intervenes directly into the family. And I think kind of, if you really want to solve the drug problem in Scotland, you get the state out, because it's state intervention, it's undermining. So we have, this is the state, or the government, that tells its teachers, orders its teachers, literally, that they go into a classroom, and the idea that a woman has a penis is a legitimate social fact. Now, I don't want that state intervening in anything, really, let alone the drug crisis. So there is a role for state intervention. But I think the point we need to ask is, who is the state? What are they intervening in? And is that intervention accountable to us? Is it are they shaping societies in the way that we want them to be shaped? And I think the overwhelming, answer to that question, particularly from a kind of Western European sensibility, is not that the state is a driver of this problem and not a solution. That's not to say that the state doesn't have a role to play in other, but where there is a serious democratic deficit, where there is a serious rupture between us, the people, and the societies we want to live in, and the societies that are being forged through these kind of ideological dogmas, I think the state, my response is to keep the state out as much as possible.
Again, these are fantastic questions. I got a few more, but for one I would like to do a quick lightning round with all of you. So just give like a 30 seconds to 1 minute answer. So what kind of arguments can pro-legalization countries bring up in favor of legalization? So if you would have to steelman the argument for legalization in 1 minute, what would be the one argument that you would say, oh, all right, that's one argument I'm willing to accept in favor of drug legalization?
None at the moment. The one argument I would have that would sway me is that we have a state that is accountable to the people. And then I might, if the people demand legalization, then hey-ho, we have legalization. But at present, that's not the relationship we have.
Yeah, I'd make a very similar point, unfortunately. The one thing that would persuade me was a true democratic mandate for legalization. If you properly poll your people and they're like, look, we want to try this, like let's zone cannabis use and let's legalize it, then I would be like, yeah, okay, let's try that on, let's see how that feels, and let's see where we are in a few years' time. If we don't like it, we can reverse it. If it seems like it's working, we can keep it. But let's have an honest and open and frank discussion about where we want society to go and take it there.
Once again, from the perspective of my country, I see there is no measurable benefit by legalization drugs like cannabis. So, but we see a lot of disadvantages, and so I see still no sense in legalizing it. So.
There are a lot of arguments which look like they make sense, especially if we just look at one aspect of the problem on the short run. But I will go back to my Lily example. So I think that if we legalize it and then later we figure out that it was a bad move, it's very, very hard to go back to the initial situation. And if we consider all of the social and economic costs of drugs on the long run, then I think that all the arguments are against legalization.
Mónica?
I think I'm going to be the one more pro, and I would approach the question from the point of view of costs and benefits. And I've mentioned Uruguay, where the situation was assessed, including what advantages the legalization of marijuana, bringing in a very enlightened regulation model, would create for Uruguayans. And the conclusion was, independently of the margin of maneuver that the state was trying to make to deal with more serious problems, was the fact that legalizing marijuana, those types of marijuana, making plants available for and creating clubs, highly regulated, could perhaps protect Uruguayans from the more dangerous synthetic varieties of marijuana that are now producing schizophrenia. The other approach, which also involves costs and benefits, and that was very clearly present in the decision to legalize alcohol in the US, is the cost to institutions, the viability of institutions. If what is at stake is the corruption of the police, the unviability of the justice system, and of these key authorities for an ordered society, then I think going down the road of some regulated model would be worth considering. The irony is that the US, by going to the extremes between prohibition and full legalization, instead of considering mid-term solutions or more center solutions, gave up the possibility of a more regulated alcohol market, like was created in Canada or the Nordic countries. So they ended up paying a higher price for endorsing unviable and costly prohibitionist paths.
I'm going to go very slightly over time. Two sentence answers, because I think we talked a lot about macro questions on this panel, but maybe to focus a little bit more on the micro question for this last question, which I think is a very good one. Who could help an addicted person the most? The government, society, or the media? Go.
Society.
Has to be society, come on.
All right.
The society, never the media.
If you look at the basketball team, we have the head coach, we have coaches for every position, we have a manager who is looking for potential trades, and we have hundreds of people who are working on the team. I think that the problem is much bigger problem than whether a basketball team will win tomorrow or lose. So I think that we should use all measures available.
All right. Mónica?
I think society, but I think government has a big role to play in terms of education. And possibly also medical assistance that is, again, more enlightened.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for great questions. Please join me in giving a hand to a fantastic panel.
Thanks very much for the wonderful panel. We will now hold a 15-minute short coffee break and reconvene at 3:15 here for our last panel of the day.